My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm with Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife, and I'm excited that we're having this program on game cameras. If you're not familiar with Vermont Coverts, we are a small statewide nonprofit that helps educate landowners about managing woodlands for wildlife. A number of our cooperators on this call, so to those of you that are here, hello and welcome. It's good to see you. And we're really excited for this. If you would please mute yourselves so that we don't have the background noise, that would be great. In addition, we'll take questions. You can type them in the chat box and then I'll relay them to Katie at the end so that we can all begin and continue to learn about using game cameras to see that wildlife that we love so much that may be a bit elusive to us. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Katie. I do want to let you know that we are recording this and we will post it to our YouTube channel, so you can always go rewatch this or share it with others as well. And you can find us by looking up Vermont Coverts on YouTube. If there aren't any other things that I need to say, I'm going to pass it on over to Katie.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa and Tina, for hosting. I'm excited to talk about game cameras. So I'm going to share my screen. Great. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. So today I'm hoping to do an introduction to game cameras. We'll talk a bit about camera placement and settings. And as Lisa mentioned, there'll be time for questions at the end. Before I really get started, I wanted to touch a bit on the mission of Vermont Fish and Wildlife. So our aim is the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for all of people of Vermont. And we do that both in species-specific conservation strategies as well as ecosystem-based. And so a lot of my experience has been on the American Marten and Lynx projects, so more species-specific projects, and you'll hear about those today, but I wanted to make sure that you are aware that we do have these broad ecosystem-based initiatives as well. So my game camera experience comes from time working with Vermont Fish and Wildlife as well as the New York State DEC. In Vermont, I've worked on the American Marten project, which was a collaboration between the U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, and Central Connecticut State University. A picture on the right here is actually from some of those game cameras. We'll talk a little bit more about that particular set coming up, but on the bottom there you can see two marten next to the bait tree. I've also worked on the Lynx project, which is a collaboration between Fish and Wildlife, a graduate student at UMass Amherst, Alexei Seren, as well as New Hampshire Fish and Game. And that project was looking at the distribution of lynx between both New Hampshire and Vermont and better understanding their habitat use. And throughout that time, we've also worked with several nonprofits, including Cold Hearted Canada and the Equinox Preservation Trust. So why game cameras? I'm sure that a lot of you already have your reasons. You have chosen to join this webinar. And oftentimes it's really, we're interested in what's in our backyard, right? We're curious to see if those tracks are what we think they are. We're curious to see how large that buck is that we're hoping to get this fall. And we're just excited to see what animals are in those forests. But there are also other reasons that we might choose to use game cameras. Some folks are interested in using them as security cameras, perhaps around their camp when they're not there. And then, as a lot of my experience has been, more research-based. So research comes with some stricter protocols that we want to adhere to make sure that our detection rates are consistent from camera to camera to allow us to analyze the data. But there are many reasons, and so hopefully I'll hear some of yours at the end today. I wanted to share this photo too because it's a fun one with the bear saying hello. Okay. So a question that I get very frequently, and it's a hard question to answer, is what camera should I buy and what model? And it's a really personal question, I think. It really depends on what you want out of a game camera, and it depends on what your goals are. But I really like to direct folks to go to trailcampro.com It's certainly not an advertisement for them, but they have some wonderful information. They do independent reviews of each model that they are selling, and it can just be really helpful to see how those cameras perform. They'll give you some test photos. They also have just some articles and information. So we're going to talk about flash type and detection distances and things like that today. You may walk away with, a general understanding today, and I'd certainly be happy to answer more of your questions. But you may also try that website to see some of their reviews and articles to help better answer your questions. Prices typically are going to range between $50 and $500, but I would say that around $150 will get you a really high quality game camera. I've used multiple brands, but I'm pretty comfortable recommending Bushnell and Browning cameras. They're pretty user-friendly. They have really good photo quality, and the battery life seems to be very strong. So those are a few good brands to start with if you're kind of in the market, if you will. And then some other features that you're going to want to consider when purchasing a camera. You're going to think about the flash type, the trigger speed, or how quickly that camera can recover once it makes a detection to take the next photo, whether or not it has a viewing screen to allow you to set up the camera setup, as well as view the photos that you've taken and aim your camera, and a warranty. Now, flash types I'll get into a little bit more in a few slides, but there's two basic types. It's a white flash, or kind of the flash you would think of with a normal digital camera, white light. And there's also infrared, and there's kind of a varying scale of how infrared that flash is. But no glow means that even a human would not see any flash. When the flash goes off, red glow, you're going to see a faint red light. And so if you're thinking about a security camera, you're probably going to want to go with that infrared no glow. Okay, so here you can see several camera options that are on the market today. In the upper left, you have a Browning, the middle is a Bushnell, and then on the far right is a Equinox. Equinox are often kind of considered cream of the crop. They're typically the most expensive, but I would suggest to you that some of the cameras, again, that are $100 to $200 are actually really good quality. They have great clarity, and if a bear decides to chew on your camera, you won't be as upset. So again, those Bushnells and Brownings are great options. In the bottom left, there is a cellular enabled camera. So these are kind of new and upcoming in the camera market. It seems like the technology is just always changing and always evolving. These are probably of interest to hunters. So if you have cell service, which in Vermont may or may not be the case, but if you do have cell service, these cameras will actually send you the photos in pretty close to real time as they're taken. And so you can know what animals are at your tree stand, or what animals are passing by your pond. So it's a pretty cool technology, but again, you need cell service to be able to utilize those. Again, I discussed a little bit the white light versus infrared before, but this is a really good picture to help demonstrate that. So on the left, you're going to see deer that was taken with a white or an incandescent flash, and you'll see that you can notice color even at night. You're going to notice a shadow right behind the stick there. I'll try and highlight that with my cursor. So this definitely produces a pretty bright flash, and oftentimes that can spook some animals like deer and coyote. So you just have to keep that in mind if that's what you're going to purchase, but some folks like it because they do get the color at night. Whereas the infrared flash, you're going to get a varying grayscale at night, which maybe isn't what you want, but I found that it's much less apt to spook your target animal. And so it can be a really good option to make sure you get a wide variety of animals. Okay, now just some basic camera anatomy. So in the top, the black kind of rectangle that you see, that is the motion or heat detector. Some cameras are equipped with both, others, it might be one or the other. On either side of that, the 4 kind of clear plastic circles. Those are your light source, again, either white or infrared, and then your camera lens is placed directly in the center. The configuration may be different just depending on the brand, but that's typically, what you'll see on most cameras. Now on the bottom left, you'll see the viewing screen, and this is super duper helpful, especially if you're new to game cameras. I really like it because it helps me aim my camera, and I can review photos in the field. Some cameras will advertise a screen. It's really good to just double check and make sure you understand what they mean. Sometimes it'll be a very small screen that simply allows you to set the camera up and scroll through the menu. So you want a screen like this one here where you can both set up the menu as well as view photos and aim your camera properly. And then on the right are just the menu buttons to set up the camera. Okay, now a bit more. On the left, you'll see the mounting bracket and mounting strap. There are all sorts of different configurations when it comes to mounting, but I liked this mounting bracket because it allows you to pivot the camera in relation to the tree, and that can be very helpful for aiming. Mounting straps are pretty ubiquitous amongst all camera types, but it is good to know that some manufacturers ask you to actually use a cable lock, and so that's going to be a little bit of a different setup. You can also add a cable lock to this particular set. You can see the hole here, and that is meant to be able to lock your camera to the tree. On the right-hand side, we have the SD card opening, the battery compartment, and then a port for auxiliary power. As long as you're using lithium batteries, I haven't really found an issue with battery life, and so auxiliary power probably isn't as important, but just in case you were interested in the battery backup, that would be where you would hook that into. Okay, so besides a game camera, what else will you need? You're going to want at least 2 SD cards. These are typically the normal size SD cards, not the micro SD cards. And I say 2 or more because you're going to want one card that is in your camera and one that is blank that you can go out and swap with when you check your camera. So you can put that blank one in and then take the photos from the other one home. That saves you some trips to your camera. If this is a hunting scenario for you, it's also going to minimize your scent at the camera. And again, it just saves you a trip. Lithium batteries, I would highly recommend these. Some folks try and get away with alkaline, but to be honest, they don't last very long, especially if you want to get into shoulder seasons or into winter. Lithiums are really going to be what you need to make sure that you don't have to be out there quite frequently. A computer or photo viewer, if you have a camera that has that viewing screen, then perhaps that takes care of it for you. But a computer is always really helpful, right, to look through your photos, to check the dates, to compare animals between one set and the next. So I would, just want to make sure that you can view those photos. And then a bait or lure. We'll talk about this in the next slide, but you want to place your camera in a good location, and bait and lure can kind of supplement those efforts. And then obviously landowner permission if you're not placing this camera on your own land. Okay, so bait and lure. Now, I will fully admit that a lot of my experience, again, has been on Marten and Lynx projects, so that's a lot of what I'll talk about, but I will provide a little bit of information on other species. I would say, though, if you have a very specific species like turkey that you're hoping to get on your camera, YouTube actually has some hunters who have some really good advice for very specific species. So I'll do what I can to touch on it, but you should know that bait is a food that is used to attract animals to a camera set. So for the Marten project, we use sardines in winter. Lures are an attractant, often visual or scent-based, to bring an animal in, but those should never ever replace proper placement and knowing the animal's habits and picking good locations where they will be frequenting. I do want to mention and kind of remind you that it is illegal to feed deer and bear in Vermont. And so anything that you do to bait or lure should never be feeding those animals. So if you have any questions on specific baits or lures that you're hoping to use, it's always best to just check in with your local game warden and make sure that you're not breaking the law in any way. We certainly wouldn't want you to do that. So just check with your local game warden and they can certainly help you. I did want to talk a little bit about this particular set. So this is a lynx set here in this photo, though it is a bobcat that is in the photo. So you can see that we have a snow stake because we were interested in snow depth for these photos. And so our lures that are interesting for this set, we have a skunk-based lure that's kind of on the back of this stake. It's made with skunk gland oil as well as Vaseline. And then you can't see it in this photo, but hanging off the top, we have some fishing line with a turkey feather. And so that skunk lure acts as a long distance call lure to bring animals in. There's a CD, not in view of the camera right now, but that would be kind of a mid-distance visual attractant or visual lure. And that CD is on a swivel, so it shines in the sunlight. So if a cat comes in from a distance, it sees kind of the sparkle. Think if your cat at home sees the sparkle of the CD, it's a little closer. And then to get them right in front of the camera, because we want to get their photo, we have this turkey feather on the fishing line right in front of the camera. And so that has multiple steps, right, to get our animal right where we want it. But that does not mean that we are not going to pick a good location that we anticipate getting cats at. So you can think along those lines. There are many different ways to kind of lure these animals in front of your camera. Okay, so this might be the next couple slides, or maybe the drier part of the presentation. But I think it really is important to talk about camera settings, because I think sometimes there can be confusion on what these settings mean. You get a big booklet with your camera and maybe it's just a little confusing to know what to choose. So I wanted to go through the options. These settings are specific to the Browning camera because that's what I had on hand. I don't mean to just keep talking about that, but that's what I had. But these are fairly kind of across the board settings that you're going to run into. So date and time, that's actually really important. It may sound simple, but to make sure that we have good metadata, or the data that is attached to each photo, we want to make sure that our date and time is good. And that is really important too if you're going to undertake some citizen science, or even just being able to share your photos with others. They want to make sure that that info strip on the bottom is giving accurate information. We also have several modes that are options. So trail mode is that motion activated mode. Time lapse typically is motion as well as a set time during the day where photos will be taken. So I mentioned with the Lynx cameras that I had a snow stake there. I used time lapse for those cameras because I wanted to see how snow changed from morning to evening. So I had time lapse set to take a photo every morning, every evening, as well as motion in between. So that's one application. And then finally, video. And video just allows you to get a video when the camera is triggered. Obviously, you're going to want a larger SD card for that application, but it can be really fun to see animal behavior, and it's a lot easier to see that with video than perhaps just a still photo. Capture delay, that's talking about how quickly the camera is going to take that photo or video once it detects an animal. Cameras typically have a range of options somewhere between no delay and 60 minutes. I would recommend something between 3 to 5 seconds. That's going to allow your animal to have time to actually get into the camera's field of view. If you trigger the camera a little early, maybe you're only going to get a tip of the ear or the top of the head. But if you give the animal just a few more seconds, then you might actually get the head and the neck and the body in the photo. The longer delays, I don't typically use those. The application that I can think of where you might want a longer delay is if you were in a state that allowed baiting, perhaps like a feed pile, and you didn't want, just like photos every minute, perhaps you'd want a longer delay, but I don't really think that would be the case here in Vermont. Picture size, anywhere typically from 4 megapixels to 18. It is a bit of a gimmick sometimes when you're looking at cameras to buy and they're advertising these really high megapixels. Read the fine print. Sometimes those megapixels are actually interpolated, and so the real photo quality might be somewhere around 8 megapixels. So just be aware of that. I would say that aiming for probably 8 to 10 megapixels for one of these photos is probably, pretty average and should provide a good quality. Video quality is similar, different options, and I think that's more of like I don't typically use video, but I think that's typically a scale. So, kind of like good, great, best, if you will. And then multi-shot mode. So multi-shot mode allows that camera to take multiple photos per detection. If you don't do this, I would highly recommend this multi-shot mode. It's really helpful to be able to properly ID your animals. And so like I was mentioning, if an animal just barely gets into the frame and you just get an ear, well, having multiple photos means it's more likely that you're actually going to get the rest of that animal. Burst means that one detection will trigger the camera to take a burst of however many photos you set. So let's say 3. Triggered means that the camera needs to be triggered each time to take that burst of 3. So I would typically recommend something along the lines of 3 burst. So this is a video that Jennifer Waite shared. I think Jennifer is probably on today, so thank you for sharing. And this is a fisher that you'll see. So I'll play it a couple of times. So that's a good example of that video mode. I've been showing a lot of just photos, but this is kind of the benefit of seeing the video and getting to see that behavior, especially if that fisher was even in the kind of the rear even more, where you had more time to watch it investigate. Okay, and then this is the multi-shot mode that I was talking about. So the photo on the left is the first in that series, and you can see that you see the moose, but you kind of just get its behind, right? Well, then you get photos 2 and 3, which are on the top and bottom, respectively. And you can see that with that burst, you actually start to get some better photos of the moose. And I would say that this last photo actually is the best. So if I hadn't set it to multi-shot mode, I would have only gotten this photo, which isn't bad, but this one's much better. Okay, a few more settings to get through, and then we will move on to site selection. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about time-lapse photos. So as I mentioned before with the Links project, I use time-lapse to be able to understand snow depth throughout the day. So to do that, you're going to have to tell the camera how frequently you want it to take those extra photos and at what time of day. So you might say morning, afternoon. In some cameras, that's really all the options you get, like morning, afternoon. Other cameras, you can tell at a specific time. So 6 a.m. and 4 p.m. It just depends on the model that you select. Temperature units. This is going to be what displays in that information strip at the bottom of your photo. Celsius or Fahrenheit. And again, you can turn that information strip on or off. SD card management. This simply means that if your card runs out of room, you can allow it to delete some of your first photos in favor of those current photos that it's currently taking. I don't typically like this option because I want to have my set photos to make sure that I know when I was there and that I can see the progression throughout time. But if you're a deer hunter, you might consider using this option. If you want to know, let's say, what activity is closest to your hunt, you may not be quite as concerned if you lose some of your early photos in favor of the more current photos. So this really comes into play if your SD card is running out of room. Ways to avoid having to use this is to get a larger SD card and or check the card more frequently and or make sure that you don't have things falsely triggering your camera. And we'll talk about that false trigger coming up. Motion test is an option that most cameras have. It allows you, as you're setting the camera up, to test and see if the camera can detect you walking in front of it. So in the sets I've shown you so far, that's not quite as important, but if you're aiming on an open field or maybe an apple orchard, you may want to use this feature. You might walk in front of the camera at different distances away to see what the camera is actually going to detect, and it might help you aim your camera and or place it properly. Typically, it will kind of shine a light at you to tell you that yes, it can detect you, or it'll take a test photo so that you can see what it's actually detecting. So this feature would only really be used during setup. So name of camera, that's going to be again in your information strip. You might select something like backyard, apple orchard, pond, just something to kind of jog your memory of where that location was. Default settings, I wouldn't really recommend these. The fact that you're on this webinar means that you're interested in game cameras and you're going to want to select your own settings. This would really just provide the factory defaults. So I would always select no on that particular one. And then delete all. This might seem like it doesn't really make sense, but it's actually very useful when you're trying to format a new SD card. So when you go to your camera, you're going to take your old SD card out, right? You're checking it, and you're going to put a new SD card in that's empty. At that point, once the new SD card is in, you can select delete all. And by doing that, you're going to format your SD card to your camera settings. And again, this is probably more important for citizen science or research applications, but it makes sure that you preserve the metadata. So that can be really useful. And lastly, software upgrade. That's an option in your menu to allow you to upgrade the firmware. Occasionally, these camera companies will come out with updates, and so you would use that to actually hook your camera to the computer and make sure it's all updated. Okay, so we talked about time-lapse and motion activated. It's hard to see this without looking at a whole range of photos, but I wanted to take two examples to kind of make the point. On the left here, you see a red fox at a camera site, same site as on the right. So the left was motion activated by the fox entering the field of view. On the right was simply a photo at a specified time. So in the afternoon, that was my afternoon snowdepth shot. And so again, you could select the time-lapse feature on your camera to get both motion and time-lapse function. Okay, now choosing a camera site. This is so important. I really want to stress this. This is just as important, if not more important, than finding the right lure or finding that perfect bait for the species you're interested in. Choosing a camera site largely is going to be probably based on what you're interested in capturing on your camera. So we want to think about forest types or edge habitat. Think about what that animal is going to be using. They need food, they need water, they need shelter. Think about where they're going to be walking through. And so, when I'm working in the winter in the Green Mountain National Forest, it's really rare that I see a lot of tracks in an open hardwood stand. But if I get to a mixed wood stand, I see a lot more tracks. Those animals are finding cover. They're finding some seeds in the conifers. And so we want to think about these things too. This picture is some management that's happening at Coolidge State Forest. And so even that brush this winter and spring can act as cover for animals. So we want to think about those things. We also want to look for game trails. And if we're using cameras on shoulder seasons, we're going to think about snow depth and southern exposure. So a lot of animals are not going to want to wade through chest deep snow. They're not going to want that super cold weather. And so a lot of them are going to move to areas with some warmth from the sun or where the snow depth is less. And so if you're trying to get a deer in that time, you're probably going to want to look in those areas with southern exposure to increase your chances, or where there's a deer yard, right? So all things to consider. So these are just some fun photos to kind of emphasize that point. Here we have a turkey track, a coyote scat, and then a bear-scarred beech here on the right. Again, thinking about food sources, beech, oak, apples, all of those things are great sources of food for many animals. Down here on the bottom right, this is an old apple orchard with a lot of edge habitat. So coyote and other things, bears, might be really interested in this habitat, especially come fall when there's a lot of apples on the ground. And then on the left here, we have just an area where an animal has been scraping up the leaves looking for nuts. And so all of these things are things that we want to be keenly aware of when we're walking through the woods and selecting the location. Okay, and so we've set our camera up, we've gotten all of our supplies, and now we've selected a location. How do we set a camera? I was really hoping to be able to do this part in the woods with you. Unfortunately, with COVID, that wasn't really a possibility. So I will do my best to replicate this with Zoom. But generally, we want our camera, which is here in this yellow box, to be facing north. This allows the sun to rotate behind the camera, and that's really important to make sure that we don't get glare into the camera lens. If you do, sometimes the camera will be falsely triggered. It'll leave you with a bunch of photos of white, and that's not something that you really want. Or if it will take a photo with some clarity, often it's really blurry and or just, again, pretty white. So we want to make sure that the sun is rotating behind the camera. We want to make sure that our point of interest is within the camera's ability to detect the motion as well as the flash's range, especially at night. So in this example, which is a Marten set, you can see that the camera and then the bait, which is on the right tree, is approximately 12 feet apart. It's going to depend on your camera's capabilities, how far that distance can be, but I found that this is a pretty good kind of standard distance. And you can also notice that my bait tree is slightly uphill of my camera. And that's really helpful when I go to aim my camera. Having that slight uphill slope means that I don't have to manipulate my camera very much to get a good quality photo both of my sardine can and the base of that tree. And again, you probably aren't going to be using sardine cans like I did, but I hope the point translates that you want to aim to your game trail or your apple orchard or whatever you're interested in well. Okay, so height above the ground and profile. Profile, you're really going to want to consider if you're hunting, if this camera is right below your tree stand, something like that. You want to make sure that it's not an obvious camera to deer. To be honest, in my experience, I haven't noticed that deer are very spooked by these cameras, especially with an infrared flash, but you'll want to experiment. You'll want to try it on your own land and see what you find. Another really, really important thing is to make sure that you remove excess brush. So on our property here, you can see that there really wasn't much brush to remove, but on the base of the tree of interest here, we'd want to remove any ferns, perhaps hobblebush if you had it, things that are going to trigger the camera when the wind blows. If you don't remove that, oftentimes you can get a lot of kind of null detections just by those leaves and branches moving in the wind. We also want to think about branches that might actually be overhanging the camera. If you imagine that this was a spruce tree, if snow load gets really heavy, those branches will get weighted and actually cover in front of the camera, and you'll get the same sort of problem. So making sure that we remove that vegetation is really important. If we're doing this again for a hunting application, maybe you'd use some gloves to control scent. Bobcat, coyote, other animals are going to be sensitive to flash type, so we want to consider that. And then I've noted just edge habitats for turkey. Again, picking a good location for your camera. And then deer, as I mentioned before, you might choose to put a camera at a deer stand location. Okay, so these are just some close-ups. Again, you can see this mounting bracket here. If you don't have a camera with a mounting bracket, that's really not a problem. There's some easy solutions to get around that. you can find a couple sturdy sticks and actually use them to help you angle the camera forward. You can use different stick configurations and just kind of play around with that. But you also notice that I've wrapped the extra kind of tail around the tree. Again, that's just in an effort to make sure that nothing is going to falsely trigger the camera. And these are just close-ups of the sets I've already mentioned. It should be noted too, depending on what you want, there's a myriad of different sets you could make, and so kind of the sky is the limit. It's really fun to experiment and explore and see what you can get to come into your cameras. Okay, just a few things you're going to want to double check before you leave your camera in the woods. You've put in so much effort, right? And so we want to make sure that our battery level is high, that our SD card is unlocked, date and time are good, and that our camera is aimed. The lock feature on these SD cards is pretty sneaky. So there's this little button right here on every SD card, and if you slide it down, it locks the card. That allows you to save photos and prevent them from being deleted. But if that is locked, that means that the camera can't write new photos onto the card. So when you're putting a card into the camera before you leave, make sure that that is unlocked so the camera can write. Some cameras are smart enough to kind of alert you if it's locked, but not all are. And so you're going to want to make sure you check that. And then check frequency. That's really up to you. Your batteries, especially during summer, will last several months, but you may want to come more frequently to make sure a bear hasn't rubbed up against it, or if you want to freshen your lures, things like that. Okay, so this is a photo that Jennifer Waite shared with us, so thank you for sharing that. Just a few things on data management. I know that my background is probably heavier towards this because I've done a lot of the research end of things, but I do have a few suggestions for citizen scientists or just interested folks. So one really big thing that I see folks doing is taking their digital camera into the field to view their photos. I really want to caution you against this. When you do that, the SD card going into your digital camera can actually alter the date stamps or the metadata with those photos, and it can even lock the photos so you can't see them when you put the card into your computer. It doesn't happen every time, but when it does happen, it's a really big bummer. So I would caution you against that. Best to just look at the photos on the viewer screen or to wait until you get home to see them on your computer. And so that goes into the preserving the metadata dates. Saving photos in logical folders where you can find them. Perhaps you could name your camera by site or by date so that you can find them again. Taking GPS coordinates is also a solution. And saving a second copy. So it might be good to have a copy on your computer, but also having some on external hard drive so you can access it later. If one gets lost, it won't be that big of a deal. Tagging, that's the process of identifying what we see in a photo so that we can analyze the data and actually make photos data. There are many software programs that you can use. I'm going to talk a little bit about CPW Photo Warehouse. That's an access-based program, but again, if that's not the program that you're interested in, there are many options, some of which are free. CPW itself is free. And then this is a little bit off topic, but with time-lapse photos, it is good to know that sometimes these cameras will take the photos in a TLS format when they're time-lapse, and that's often hard to view in your computer. So you're going to want to convert that probably to a JPEG format. Software like IrfanView can do that for you. I'd be happy to discuss that more in the question segment if someone is interested about that specific thing, but most of you probably may not have to worry about that. So if someone's interested, just let me know. Okay, so Vermont Fish and Wildlife, we keep track of all of our camera locations. This is a mapping software that allows us to do that. You can see the pink points, the yellow points, the blue points are all cameras. In this case, each color represents a different check person who's responsible for that camera. But the real point here is just showing you that there are ways to map where we have set cameras in the past. And I want to encourage you that this is something that you can do on your own. So Vermont has a natural resources atlas. It's a wonderful program. It's a website, so you can see the address up here, but Google will find it pretty quickly for you. And it's really a great tool to be able to research your neighborhood, research the forest that you might want to explore this fall when you're hunting. And so you can put points on the map, just like I did on the previous slide, but you can also pull up map data and look at different layers. You can look at things like soil types, wetland delineations, parcel data. You can even look at these ortho images, right, to see deciduous versus coniferous forest. It's just a really neat tool. So if you haven't taken the time to explore it, I would highly recommend that. And just encourage you that you too can map from home. You can even measure things like distances on this, so pretty fun. Okay, briefly on tagging, this is the Colorado Parks and Wildlife program. It allows us to assign information about each photo to that photo. So this particular one, you can see the bobcat in the bottom right. I've noted that species as well as snow depth and temperature for this particular site because I was interested in those variables as well. And after doing that, they can kind of take all of the photos at once, and I can compare all of the black bear photos or all of the fisher photos. And so in this photo, you can see I was able to ID this individual mom and her several cubs. But I could also scroll down if this was active and live and see all of the black bear photos I've received. And so it's a unique way for me to be able to kind of scan through the photos I've collected. I can also better understand my total effort. And this is, again, important for us at Vermont Fish and Wildlife to quantify how many photos we've collected, how long our cameras have been in the field, the date ranges that they've been in the field. And so, again, it's just a way to condense our data and really take our photos and make our photos into data. And what's really fun is to actually see the output of that data. Right, so this is some data from Equinox Preservation Trust cameras in Manchester, Vermont. And you can see that we identified only fisher photos and what time of day those fisher were active. And so you can see that these are pretty crepuscular animals, right? We have a lot of activity in the morning and then also in the evening, not so much during the day. And so this is a pretty small data set, but if we do this with large quantities of data, we can start to pick out individual species, compare the species, compare detections at each site. So it gets pretty complex, but pretty interesting as well. And I included this very briefly. I could talk more about the Marten and Fisher project if folks are interested, but I wanted to show you how photos become data. And this is from the Marten and Fisher study conducted through 2015 through 2018. We have new data that has not been added to this yet, but you can see that on the left side, the red polygons denote Marten detections. And so we see that we found Marten on our game cameras around Glastonbury Wilderness in southern Vermont, as well as Somerset Reservoir, but we did not detect them in these areas kind of around those red polygons. On the right, we can see that fisher, the blue polygons, highlight where we did see fisher. We saw them in almost our entire study area. And so again, we're seeing how photos become data. Okay, now I'm just gonna share some fun photos before we wrap up and take questions. This video was contributed by Sandy Cutting, another Coverts participant. So thank you again for sharing. I really liked Sandy's video because it's a unique way to use game cameras. A lot of the things I've shown you are kind of forest-based, but I thought this was really unique. Okay, and then we'll just go through a few more photos. So here's a bobcat, and a lot of these I should mention are in the Green Mountain National Forest. Obviously a deer, marten, moose, Another Marten, you'll find that I'm partial to Marten. The mom with her cubs. This is an otter, actually. There's some wet areas surrounding this camera, and so this otter was just passing through. A fisher, coyote. You can see a bobcat here in the back. A mother bear. She's a super pretty bear with this chest blaze here, and she has 3 yearlings actually this year, so 2016. You can see one actually behind her, and then in this next photo you can see the 2 others. They look quite rambunctious to me, but I got a lot of photos of that mom and her yearlings, and it was always fun to see how they were growing and developing. Another Marten, moose. Okay, and that is all. So I'll turn it back over to Lisa and be happy to answer any questions.
Great, Katie, thanks. Sure, we have a question from Tina. She wanted to know if you recommend a size of the SD card for like still photos versus videos, since videos take up more room. What size SD card might they want to put in their cameras?
So I would suggest 8 gigs to 16 gigs if you're just going to use photos. I don't have a lot of experience with videos, but I'm going to say that you probably want 16 or greater, maybe 32 gig. A lot of it's going to depend too on how frequently you're checking, but I would say probably 32 gig for video.
All right. Lisa wants to know, if you have video, do you need burst?
If you select video, my understanding is that you are just going to get videos when the camera is active. That's my understanding with the camera models I've used. Perhaps you have a camera that will do both photo and video, and in that case, I'm not sure. You'd want to check with your user manual, but typically it's one or the other.
And wondering if you could clarify a little about using bait and where bait might be legal or illegal, and how best people could find out that information, to be sure that they are doing things properly.
Yeah, so I had a conversation with some of our game wardens, and they wanted me to emphasize that, again, feeding deer and bear is not legal. Things like salt licks would be considered feeding, and so not legal. But you might consider using something like a scent-based lure that they wouldn't be consuming. So I mentioned skunk lure. There are other lures you can get from trapper stores like Minnesota Trapline that are simply a scent that you might apply to a tree, your bait tree, if you will, kind of up above, just to get that scent into the air. But I would really recommend, if you have any questions, to give your local game warden a call. They can certainly clear up those questions, let you know if what you're considering is legal, illegal, and then you don't have to worry about it. So always just consult with them.
Okay. Lily wanted to know, was the graph that you showed creating using that CPW software technology?
Yeah, it was. So CPW is actually a free download. It's a little clunky to set up sometimes if you're not familiar with it, and you'll need access. But once you tag your images, you can actually select the species you're interested in, even the camera sites you're interested in, and then based on what you found, your detections, and how you tag those images, it created that graph. So that was all within that program. So it's pretty fun to start comparing different sites like that.
Mary wants to know, what specific lures do you use for different animals? How are you targeting? What are you choosing?
Yeah, so again, my experience is largely Marten and lynx. For lynx, we are using those visual attractants, so the CD, the feather, both on swivels, and then a skunk lure, which is scent-based. And that skunk lure is skunk land oil mixed with Vaseline, so it sticks around for a while. The skunk lure seems to be a pretty versatile scent lure, but not a lot of people like to make it, right? Because it's pretty stinky. But it works well for marten, works well for fisher, bear. Yeah, So for Marten, we also use something that we can get at like Minnesota Trapline called Marten Magic, and that is a little sweeter of a smell, has a little bit of a minty flair. But they make all sorts of lures. If you've ever taken a look, things for coyote. So you can just look around, but you'll probably want to test it out and see. So.
All right. So fairly universal. Some of them. I know we put one out. I actually don't know what lure we use, but we've got 7 species that went through. And part of it is the trail, like where you choose to put it. More than one species will use that area often, I find. Right. And so you kind of you get lucky. And once you figure out that, you can get a lot of species going through.
Yeah. And again, using like an area where you expect species to travel. And if you find a good location, then continue using that location. Often they'll re-frequent the camera.
So Tina wanted to know how big an animal or motion will trigger the camera, and does that need to be adjusted with the setting? You know, she's wondering about birds that are foraging on the ground or flying through, setting off the camera.
So some cameras do have settings for kind of how sensitive it will be. I've gotten everything from a mouse to a jay, so you can get those smaller animals. On a less sensitive setting though, you're most likely to get the bigger animals, the raccoons, the foxes, things like that. If you're getting a lot of like leaf movement that you don't want, even after you've cleared the area, maybe leaves blowing by, then I would kind of back that off. But again, just testing your particular camera model against what you're seeing. You know, try it a little more sensitive, try it a little less sensitive, and see what you're getting.
Tammy wants to know, she gets a lot of squirrels, and is there a setting to change this, or should they just move the camera?
Yeah. If you're getting a lot of red squirrels, my experience is that you might be close to a midden, you might be close to some of their, their holes. So probably moving the camera is best, but yeah, I would suggest moving your camera.
All righty. Well, that looks like most of the questions in the chat box. I want to thank you for sharing with us about this. I think it's a really interesting way for people to see what's walking around in their woods. And, Vermont Coverts is really happy to bring these programs to you. And if you would like to learn about more, you can always sign up for our e-news on our website. There's also a little donate button to help us be able to bring these kinds of programs to you. And thank you so much, Katy, and Tina Varney, one of our cooperators who really spearheaded wanting to see this happen. Let's see. There's one or two more that popped up. Tina wants to know, is there a way to see who's doing research on different species if they want data from private landowners who have cameras out?
So there's eMammal, I believe, which is a kind of an international place where camera projects can post their project, and you can actually access their data. That's not so much looking for information from citizen scientists as it is sharing what's going on. If you're looking to share your data, kind of coming up and maybe in the works for Vermont Fish and Wildlife, we're considering different citizen science options. I know that programs like VLT are also considering ramping up game camera programs. So I would be more than happy to field some of those questions. If you have specific ones, I can share my email in the chat box, but I don't know of any broad scale Vermont projects at this time. So I would just kind of keep your eyes and ears open.
iNaturalist would be a great place that you could share your photos as well. And researchers do use those data for various projects that they might have. So you might be able to upload them to iNaturalist would be another one that I would suggest.
That's a good point. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. This is going to be recorded and posted so you can rewatch and learn a little bit more or share with others. We thank you so much for joining us today and hope everybody stays safe. Thank you.
Thank you.